To pick up from where we stopped in the previous session, I would like to proceed and move forward with what you should do in a moment of a crisis. Now, we find ourselves in what I consider to be the era of the three C's: accelerated change, overwhelming complexity, and what will be followed by tremendous competition. And all of these three C's have been caused by a crisis: change, competition, and complexity caused by a crisis. There is a saying that you should never waste a good crisis. In the Chinese syllabus, there is a reference to the word crisis, and it's noted to have two strokes: crisis or danger and opportunity. Like a coin, you have opposite ends. I like to use the word opposite sides. On one side, you might think crisis. On the other side, you might think opportunity. How you perceive both comes down to perspective. The question is, what do you do in a crisis? I'll say this. This is not a time for prayer or for praying. As a matter of fact, you should pray without ceasing. This is not a time for conspiracy theories, trying to understand where the public health pandemic started and why and who caused it. This is a time for intelligence. This is not a time for you to be pontificating and spreading the news from various news outlets. No. This is a time for planning and preparation. You should be planning and preparing. The question is, preparing and planning for what? Well, we go back to some of the ideas that I mentioned in the previous session. I was trying to explain from the economic side the importance of this crisis and the significance of the opportunities hidden in this crisis. I began by saying that if you looked over history, you would have to go all the way back to the 1929-1930 economic crisis, the Depression, to find similarities to potentially what could be our immediate future. In other words, the only analogous period comparable to what we are about to go through, or what we could potentially be going through, is the Great Depression. To understand the Great Depression, you have to go back to 1913 and study from 1913 a number of decisions that were made, both from the government, but more importantly, in the market, in the free market system. Leading up to 1929, the 10-year period prior saw an increase in optimism, an increase in euphoria, an increase in greed. And as a result of that, asset prices were pushed way beyond their true value. In other words, pricing overrode value. The consequence of that was a correction. A correction is where the market, after it's been pushed to an excessive point, returns back to what is considered to be reasonable or fair value. That led to a recession, the 1930 recession. The recession would have lasted a short period of time, as most corrections do. However, there were some decisions made by the government that resulted in the Great Depression. Now, most people believe that the 1930 depression was caused by the failure of the free market system. Most people are uninformed. Anyone who studied the history and the details of the history would realize that in 1913, which is prior to 1929, 1930, the Federal Reserve was created, and their responsibility was quite simple. Control the quantity of money in the economy and observe and try and regulate the prices of goods and services. In other words, control inflation. If you control the quantity of money, you automatically control inflation, because inflation is produced in only one way: printing money. If you accelerate or increase the quantity of money, you increase inflation. Now, inflation is a lagging indicator. That simply means if you increase the quantity of money, normally it will take approximately 2 years for inflation to go up. It doesn't happen immediately. Likewise, if you decrease the quantity of money, the reverse occurs. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created for that purpose. In 1930, after the recession, the quantity of money in the United States decreased. Why? Because people were not spending. People were simply hoarding and holding onto their cash. For that reason, the quantity of money decreased. That caused most people to have what we call the fear factor. And so suddenly you had what's called a run on the banks. And that simply means that people started to withdraw all of their savings from the banks. Now here's the point. If you put £10 in a bank, the bank has the authority through the central government to take your £10, multiply by 10, and loan it out. So for every £10 you put in the bank can loan out 100. It leverages your money. However, if we all started to withdraw each about £10 from the bank is in trouble because it's already loaned out so much, and now you're demanding your money. And it cannot loan out without your seed capital. And that means you have what's called a run on the bank, and that causes severe financial problems. The role of the Federal Reserve Bank at that time was simple. Increase the quantity of money so that you had stability, so people would not panic and withdraw so much. They didn't do that. And as a result of that, what was meant to be a recession led into what we had, which was a depression, which is catastrophic and severe. And we saw asset prices fall by more than 50%. To put it into context, like I did in the previous session, if the value of your asset falls by 50%, in order for it to gain and come back to where it was previously, although you lost just 50%, you would have to make 100% to break even, just to come back to the same even position you were before. And that's significant. In any case, the 50% decline in the stock market, for example, had catastrophic consequences for pensions, endowments, people's equity, jobs, livelihood, availability of cash, liquidity, availability of credit, and that caused a significant destruction of wealth. It also caused something that often happens, which is the transfer of wealth from one group to another. It wasn't something that was done from a very, you might say, benevolent way. It was simply some people were prepared and some weren't. Those who were prepared took advantage and they got wealth. They got wealthy. It's really that simple. Now, why have I spent the last few minutes explaining what happened in the 1930s, considering we are in 2020? The reason is simple. Mark Twain said that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And although history doesn't repeat in the same way, many cases, you can learn from history. A wise person once said that if anyone who does not study the past goes through life acting like a child, and that simply means if you haven't studied what happened before and you haven't gleaned from the wisdom of your forefathers or your foremothers, then you're bound to repeat some of the mistakes that they made. Now, what mistakes are we making today? Well, I often say to people, never judge proposals or people's intentions by their effects alone. You always have to, let me rephrase that, never judge people's proposals by their intentions, always judge by their effects. The government is trying to help now. Most people have been asked, especially in the Western countries, to stay back at home and not work. There's been a significant increase in what we call stimulus programs. So the first thing that happens is you drop the central banks drop their rates, their borrowing rates down to zero to stimulate the economy. The next stage is they start to either sell government bonds. In other words, they start to go into a transaction where they can borrow money. The next stage is they start to print money. It follows that sequence. First of all, you reduce the interest rates to stimulate the economy. Next, if it doesn't work, or to support the first, you borrow. In other words, you issue debts, bonds. And the third is, if it doesn't work, you print money. The third debases your currency. If you look at all Western central banks in all Western countries, there's been an influx of money to stimulate the economy and to prevent the catastrophic economic impact of this public health crisis. And what does that mean for you, the average person, you and I? It means that history is about to repeat all over again. The question is, what can we do about it? How do we prepare? In the previous session, I made reference to the fact that most governments had enacted a stimulus program whereby workers were being paid through the government to stay at home and not work. And I said the saddest part of this whole 8-week period, potentially 12-week period, and it could even extend depending on how quickly we are able to find therapeutics or find some vaccination or find some social way of reducing the impact on our lives and the number of deaths. I said that unfortunately, the saddest part of this stay-at-home period is that most people at the end of the 3 months or 2 months will come out in a worse position than they were before they went in, primarily for 2 reasons. When you're working, you're learning, and so you're improving your professional or your on-the-job skills. But there are 2 types of skills you need. Life skills is the skills you invest in yourself. In other words, you learn, and professional skills. Unfortunately, most people will spend this time, although they have been paid, they will spend this time between 8 and 10 hours. Either on social media, on the internet, on the news, watching films, and not doing anything productive. Now, think about this, 24 hours in a day. For a typical worker, you sleep 8 hours approximately. That means you are left with 16 hours. For a typical worker, I'll use myself or use London as an example. If you spend 8 hours at work, you're left with another 8 hours. However, most people will spend about 2 hours traveling to, in some cases, more than 2 hours, between 2 and 3 hours traveling to and from work. So the 8 hours of work, you add an extra 3 hours. That's 11 hours. But you have to wake up early and get ready and get prepared to go to work before you begin the travel. So you allow for another 1 hour or 1 hour and a half, and that takes the 11 hours to 12 and a half hours, all dedicated to work, which means that most people only have approximately between 3.5 and 4 hours to themselves after work. This stay-at-home period has given every single person who is not currently working 12 hours every day. 12 hours. Which means if you calculate 12 hours per day across 12 weeks, it's 1,440 hours. It's powerful. And what that means is if you take the example of a typical postgraduate or undergraduate course, if you were going to do a master's course, you could complete a master's course within, I would say, 1,200 hours. That's what's the minimum requirement. And that simply means in a 3-month period, if you invested the time that you've been given to stay at home, if you invested that in learning skills and developing yourself and working hard, you could gain within this 3-month period the equivalent of what you would call a master's degree in any subject. If you translate that to an undergraduate degree, you've technically been given, in this case, 12 40-hour weeks just to invest in yourself. And I made reference to the fact that what was slightly worrying was that at the end of the period, most people would not have invested any of that time in themselves, although they had been paid, technically paid, to do just that. The question then comes, okay, well, how do we and how do you use the time that you've been given effectively to make sure that you're able to benefit from this crisis? And that's what we'll talk about in this session going forward. I'll give you perhaps an overview of what to consider. This is just some ideas. They may not work for you, specifically in your circumstances, but they could be thought starters. They might trigger an idea. They might trigger potentially a solution that might be satisfactory to your needs. If in the 1930s the stock market or asset values fell by 50%, and in order to break back even, you needed to make 10%. You needed to make 100% to break back even. In the previous session, I went into some details. I said, well, on average, if we use the stock market as an example or as a reference point, on average, in the United States, what we call the S&P 500 index, you've gained, if you'd invested in the S&P 500 index, you would have gained 10% annually, on average, over a 50-year period, on average. Now, there's been no 2 years where you've actually been able to achieve between 8 and 12%. Some years it would be 4%, and some it would be negative, and some it would be much higher. Last year it was approximately 30%. So it varies. But on average, if you took a 50-year average, it was roughly about 10%. That simply meant that if you were to apply that to the 1930s period, in order for you to make 100%, if you were making 10% every single year, it would take you 10 years. So, in a few short months during the 1930 period, between 1930 and 1933, the prices of assets fell. However, to make back what you lost would have taken you 10 years. Now, I compare that to the season we find ourselves in. In some specific locations, in some countries, in the UK, for example, there are some companies or some sectors that have lost 70% of their value, some 75%. If you look at the oil industry, on average, they've gone down by between 70 and 75%. And this is for various reasons. However, I'm not here to talk about the specificity of the causes. I'm here to talk about what to do with the circumstances that you've been presented with. If you lose 75% of the value of an asset, to break back even, you would have to make 300%. To put that into context, if it takes you 10 years to make 100%, then it would take you 30 years to make 300%. And what that means is that this opportunity, if you invert everything that I've just shared, the consequence and the opportunity are very significant. You've been handed, in principle, 30 years back to invest. The question is, what are you going to do with the time? So there's a lot of reference to inequity and inequality, and the wealthy being, or the wealthy stealing up all the riches of the poor. This pandemic is a reset button. So those who had so much wealth have lost a significant and will lose a significant part of their wealth. And those who do not have now have the opportunity to join the race. Now, there's something called the Matthew parable, or the Matthew paradox. It says, to him that has, much will be given, and to him that hath not, that which he has will be taken from him. It's a very powerful statement. And that simply means, in my opinion, it's not referring to only material things. It's referring to the mind. To him that has an idea, to him that has the right thoughts, much will be given. In other words, if you take the idea that you have in your mind, constructively apply it, then you would be given. So an idea you have implemented will create wealth. So to him that hath in his mind and works hard and applies it, much will be given. To him that hath not, in other words, anyone who does not have, the little you have will be taken from you. And that simply means you lose it. It's the law of attraction in principle and in operation. If you have, you attract more. If you do not have, you lose what you have. Now, this simply means that we've all been given an opportunity to join the race and to do right by ourselves. This is not a time for gossip and watching TV and social media and socializing. We should be applying the social distancing principle, which is, avoid as much social contact as you can. And that social contact is not simply physical. It should also be emotional and mental. Now, let me qualify that statement. That does not mean that you should not reach out to your loved ones. Of course you should. But we go back to the 24-hour analogy I used. 8 hours for sleep, 4.5 hours for interaction, and you were spending roughly 12.5 hours getting ready for work, traveling to work, traveling back from work. And all I'm saying is, in this time where you're being paid, well, obviously, some countries are not paying their citizens, but most countries in the West are, where you're being paid to stay at home and not work. You now should take that 12.5 hours and dedicate that 12.5 hours to study. What should you study? That's a good question. I'll cover that in the sessions to come. The most important subject that is worth studying today is financial education, is your finances. Why? Because opportunities like this occur once in a generation, once in 100 years. You'd have to go back 100 years to see a similar event like we're going through now. You have to be prepared. You have to be ready. How do you get ready? You have to learn, study. You gain wisdom in a chronological sequence. Information needs to be taken, and that information becomes knowledge through study. Once you have knowledge, if you comprehend that knowledge, it becomes understanding. If you apply what you understand, it becomes wisdom. If you apply the wisdom, it creates power. So the idea that, knowledge is power is completely false, because you could have the wrong set of information. You can have erroneous information. The key thing is to learn the right stuff. And so my view is actually that one of the things that should be kind of forefront in most people's agenda during this 12-week period or 8-week period is, how do we gain the most that we can in this time? I have 12 and a half hours every day. What do I invest it in? My recommendation is financial. Personal development covers various areas. I usually talk about the four aspects of education: academic, professional, personal development, and financial education. 4. This is not the time for academic or professional education. This is not the time for personal development, learning about how to lead, learning about my attitude, and learning about how to negotiate, learning how to sell. This is the time for financial education. You need to understand history. You need to understand the times we're in. Then you need to have a plan for the future. It's really that simple. So, in closing, you might ask, where do I start? Okay, I'll give you a 3-point plan. And in each of the sessions that precede, I'll address each. Number 1, the first question you should ask yourself is, where am I? The second question you should ask is, where am I going? The third, how do I get there? We start with the first. I'll give an overview on the first, and I'll stop. Where am I? If you've been to London, we have bus stops in various locations. We have the underground tube stations. We have what we call interactive maps for pedestrians and visitors. Whenever you're in a location and you cannot find, or you do not know where you are, these maps are also found at airports and large buildings like shopping complexes. You always see a map. And when you're trying to find where you are, there's always a sign that says, I am here. That's what you're looking for. It's a black dot that says, you were here. Once you understand where you are, then you can identify your destination. And then once you see your destination, it's very clear what route you must take to get there. But most importantly, what potentially could be the fastest route. Now, success is knowing where you are, knowing where you want to get to, and moving progressively in that direction. And that's what we'll cover in the sessions to come. Where am I? Very simple question, very important question.